really, what is a public good? We often talk about it quite loosely. And if you look at where it comes from well, a corrupted version of something that an ancient Roman poet said, very, very long ago. And it says that the noblest motive is the public good. And that was kind of the initiation of some of these discussions. And if we look at what a public good is, it's really a commodity or service that's provided to society without profit. And so it's available for everyone, and it's available for everyone to benefit from. But it also, particularly in the context of national parks, it includes goods that society values. And in the context of parks, that's land and seascapes, biodiversity, nature-based experiences, and the like. But there's also a very defined economic kind of way to look at what a public good is. And it's really, there's two main things about a public good. The first is that it's non-rival in consumption. So use by one person doesn't affect another person's ability to use or benefit from it, or more than one person can use it at the same time. And also, it has to be non-excludable. So people cannot be excluded from the use, or one group can't deny another group an opportunity to use such a good. So that's really what a public good is. And when did we start thinking about this public good business of SANParks? Well, I think it was very explicitly triggered with the onset of the pandemic in March 2020, when we suddenly as an organization entered these really uncharted waters of having 0 visitors to national parks, not one, which meant we were plunged into a financial crisis because more than 70% of our operating budget is self-generated through tourism. And that had like a very immediate impact, but also a very protracted, long-term knock-on impact that we still haven't recovered from. And if we look at the outlook, it's going to stay suppressed for a while still. So what we did is actually, and some of the co-authors of this work are here with us, we really looked at the sustainability of our organization overall when we are faced with a big shock like the COVID pandemic was. And I don't want you to look at this particularly, except to say that as an organization, we have these 3 key pillars. So we need to be financially sustainable, we need to have ecological intactness, so manage our national parks, but we also need to have or be societally relevant. And the COVID pandemic actually had a whole lot of knock-on effects onto all of these components and lots of feedbacks, positive and negative. Okay. So that led us to think really critically about what it is that we do as national parks. How do we think about sustainability in the medium term, so not the short term, but the medium to longer term? And what is our reason for existence? Because if we can't fund our mandate, how are we going to actually sustain ourselves? So that was really the trigger to start thinking about these things. And so we started thinking very much more explicitly about, well, do we provide a public good as SANParks or not? So we have a vision as an organization, and it's to be this world-class system of sustainable parks, reconnecting and inspiring society. We have a mission, which is quite detailed, but are we presenting a public good? So if you look at the SANParks estate, we are a system of 20 national parks. We have 3 World Heritage sites that span across 6 national parks. There's 6 marine protected areas that fall under our management. We are part of 5 transfrontier conservation areas. And so really the estate, the conservation estate, is quite large across South Africa. About 4 million hectares on land and about 370,000 hectares at sea. So that represents about 70% of the state-owned terrestrial protected areas and about 22% of the state-managed marine protected areas in the country. But is it actually a public good that we're managing? So we really also thought about what it is that we're doing, and kind of were really thinking about that. When we think about conservation, we think about it in terms of the rights in our Constitution for a safe and healthy environment. We think about it in terms of supporting sustainable development through use of resources. We think about it in terms of contributing to national objectives, economic growth, job creation, transformation. And we think about it in terms of the sustainable development goals. And really, we look at outcomes for biodiversity, but also outcomes for human well-being. And we recognize that there's synergies and tensions between those two, and trade-offs that have to be made and are made almost on a daily basis between those two sets of outcomes. But also, we kind of really started thinking about what do national parks mean, and what is the kind of intrinsic value of them. And we were trying to articulate that it's really about promoting a shared natural and cultural heritage in the country. And it's about not just all these outcomes, but it's about contributing to national solidarity and pride. And we see a role for national parks as really quite pivotal in that space. So as we started thinking about this public good mandate, so providing goods to society without profit, being available for all, we realized that this estate that we manage, this large conservation estate, really actually needs to be mobilized and mediated for people to be able to appropriate the public good. Okay, so it doesn't help you just have the estate. Somehow you need to enable people to use it. And we felt that there were actually 7 broad components to how that happens. And I'm going to talk through all 7 of those. So one is around managing biodiversity and cultural heritage, one's about sustainable use, one's about facilitating socioeconomic development, providing opportunity to access nature-based tourism, protecting and enhancing cultural, ecological infrastructure, connecting people, and then parks is providing these outdoor laboratories. So in the first instance, if we think about the actual estate and its contribution to cultural and biodiversity management, through the system of parks, we really actually are providing, through many land inclusion mechanisms, which are not only about acquisition and proclamation anymore, we are providing effective management of a wide range of national parks that are representative of South Africa's biodiversity and cultural heritage. And we use SAM, Strategic Adaptive Management, to really incorporate some societal values and expectations into how we do that. And we try and encourage ongoing learning in that process on an ongoing basis. The second component of the mandate is really about providing opportunities to access all these nature-based and cultural experiences. And if you think that globally, and this is before COVID, there were around 10 million people per year visiting protected areas in South Africa. And there were studies that really showed the benefit to people visiting protected areas in terms of emotional, psychological, and spiritual well-being. And in a survey of people visiting SANParks, these are the types of words that were coming up: relaxation, love, happiness, enjoyment. So really, actually, visits to parks do a lot for people. And interestingly, visits to nature have started being described as green prescriptions, so people to get off the rat race and to recover from everyday stresses. And what we've also found is that reconnecting people to parks and places really provides strong feedback to them, strengthening support for the maintenance and existence of these places into the future. And it can really help break some of the cycle of alienation that's become more and more common, particularly amongst young people, from nature. And so having appropriate experiences really reconnects people and can change attitudes and behavior. And we did some work which was really looking at the cultural ecosystem services flowing from 3 very different national parks, Mountain Zebra, Garden Route, and Table Mountain, and the kind of range of cultural services that are provided by those parks, and the activities that are mediating or enabling people to benefit, to gain those benefits from those parks. And really what we can see is that parks really connect people to nature in very diverse ways, but they also connected, what we found, people to people in that process, which is equally important. So the third component is really sustainable use of natural resources, and we facilitate a range of opportunities for consumptive and non-consumptive use across parks. But really, historically, there's been a large sector of society that has been excluded from accessing those resources. And so in the last 20 years, we've really tried to develop a much stronger relationship between parks and communities and their reliance and connection to the resources. So we've facilitated a much wider diversity of access, and it really aims to rebuild connections between land and heritage and people in the context of redressing some of the historical injustices. And every year we have to provide to the Minister of Environment Affairs a report on the sustainable use. So that's the consumptive use in national parks. These are the last 3 years worth of reports. And really, if we look at the last report that we just submitted in June, there's formalized extractive resource use from 17 of our national parks. There's about 261 species, terrestrial and aquatic species, that are used. And actually, a large proportion of the income that gets made is from live animal sales, about, almost 60%. And then venison or sharing of meat from parks, about 23%, and plant sales. So those are some of the kind of headline indicators. And really importantly, another component of resource use has involved relationship building and well-being enhancement with neighboring communities. And a very good example of that is in Kruger. There's, in the last year alone, about 13 tons of venison were shared with community groups on the borders of Kruger, schools, church groups, other vulnerable groups. And that's really gone a long way to reconnecting people to national parks. So contribution to socioeconomic development is also a key component of what we do. And it really reflects this kind of social contract with neighboring communities. And it really looks at large or a variety of direct and indirect benefits at multiple scales. So locally, regionally, and in terms of the national economy. And parks very often are catalysts to development in very remote and poverty-stricken areas. One of the things that's become quite a big driver in the past couple of years is SANParks' support to the transformation of the wildlife economy in South Africa. And just also again some stats, some numbers in the last year. Because of COVID, we haven't actually done that much of this, but about 600 animals from 9 species donated as wildlife loans, and about 140 animals from 3 different species donated to emerging game farmers. So that's been quite a big push in terms of a very explicit redress of the wildlife economy in the country. Then, of course, we have a whole range of working for projects or rehabilitation and restoration projects. And just in the last financial year, again, about 8,200 people directly impacted by jobs and opportunities to work on these programs across the SANParks estate, including 480 contractors from local communities. So there's quite a wide range of these types of opportunities, which are very diverse in terms of scale and impact. And this is just one example, and I don't want you to look at the detail. But in Kruger, there was an assessment done where they were looking at exactly what that range and scale of socioeconomic benefits are that are accruing to neighboring communities. And as you can see, without looking at any of the detail, it's actually enormous. So I don't want to go into that, but just to show you that actually we sometimes forget to think about the diversity and the scale of these things. Okay, the fifth component of a public good mandate in the SANParks context, we believe, is the protection and enhancement of critical ecosystem, ecological infrastructure. So water factories are something that we think about quite a lot here in the Garden Route, and it's really about, national parks helping protect some of the vital organs of Earth. And in South Africa, only about 10% of the strategic water resource areas have some form of water, of protection. And those strategic water areas actually are less than 10% of the land, which generate more than half the water that we need in this country. And yet, less than 10% of them are actually protected in any way. So SANParks is a key contributor to protecting some of these strategic water resource areas, particularly through the Garden Route and Golden Gate Highlands National Parks. But there's also other parks like Marakeli that play an important part in some of those contributions. And the new Grasslands National Park in the Eastern Cape near Maclear will actually more than double SANParks' contribution to protecting strategic water resource areas. And that's quite a nice innovative project that's underway. That's the Garden Route, and that's the new Grasslands National Park. So the challenge, though, is that looking after these strategic water areas actually incurs costs to protect them. It could be alien clearing, it could be erosion control measures, but someone needs to pay the cost to maintain these water factories. Okay, and options to actually generate an income to cover those costs of those services aren't quite clear yet, and willingness to pay by society is also not quite clear yet, because everyone thinks it's this free service that should just carry on being available. And if you look at, this is just rivers, not strategic water areas. If you look at river condition across all the rivers within national parks, those are the green ones, across rivers falling in all other protected areas, and across rivers that are outside protected areas, and you look at what their average ecological condition is, so from good to fair to poor, you can see that rivers that are falling within national parks are actually generally in a far better condition, ecological condition, than those outside protected areas. So really, some of the effort that we invest in maintaining those is very obvious, and yet we are not funded per se to do that and to deliver that good. And of course, parks also provide a really important opportunity for ecosystem-based adaptation in the face of global change and climate change. And there's a whole lot of action happening now around looking at ecosystem-based adaptation opportunities and looking at how communities around parks can also become more resilient in the face of climate change. Importantly, parks connect people, as I was saying earlier in the cultural ecosystem services study that we did. And really what we try and do through the vision is reconnect and inspire society. And we believe that this is a dimension of our public good that we haven't really explored significantly enough, or got a handle on understanding how it is that we do that, and how it is that we even consider, for want of a better word, measuring, not necessarily quantitatively, but even qualitatively, that component. So Parks for Science and Science for Parks, that's this understanding that parks are these outdoor laboratories and should be available to the public to understand change and support education. And Isak did some really nice work with co-authors looking at parks as outdoor classrooms. And really, I think, in terms of SANParks and our science function, this is one component that we do a lot of work in. So if we look at last year, lots of publications, research projects, monitoring activities happening, a lot of knowledge translation happening, through engagements, through assessing effectiveness, through planning, through environmental impact assessments. and of course a lot of knowledge sharing, networking, and capacity building in the academic world, but also in service to science. And really, there's a whole lot of key factors why that happens, and we believe having a strong internal science function in SANParks enables that to happen, that component of our public good mandate. So the public good should not, or the mandate of SANParks, should not only be accounted for in terms of conserving biodiversity or income generated through tourism. And I think that's one of the things that we've been grappling with. How do we include valuing all those other diverse opportunities that are part of this public good? So we have these parks and marine protected areas which really have the potential to deliver these public goods. And yet, if they aren't mobilized and mediated, there can be no appropriation of that public good by people. And what we've been thinking and talking a lot about is that the realization of that public good mandate is so dependent on maintaining people within an organization like SANParks. Because it's the people that enable those services very often to be appropriated, either through providing the experiences and the vehicles or through managing and maintaining the system. So we do believe that the conservation business of SANParks, which is very diverse, actually does deliver a very holistic and complex public good mandate. So if we recognize that, and that staff and the organization mobilizes and mediates that mandate, and we recognize that it costs money actually to deliver a mandate, even a public good mandate, then what's happened is COVID has really affected our ability to deliver on that mandate, because it has effectively cut off the money bags in our current financial model of being almost or 70% self-generating of income. So if we expected to sustain this public good mandate, irrespective of our funding or the economic climate or the business model of the organization, what does this mean? How are we going to do that? And that's the thing we're grappling with, and that's where my conversation's not quite finished. But I think what we've been seeing a lot is that if we enable all these connections between people and nature and people and parks to continue to flourish, then conservation becomes actually a really important and legitimate outcome of an ongoing conversation with society across all those 7 components of the mandate. And then actually national parks can become these beacons of pride. But increasingly, we are underfunded to deliver that mandate. In fact, we are significantly underfunded. So how do we then appropriately govern in that context? And this also is just some thoughts that I'm throwing out there that are very ill-developed. What we do, of course, need is the 5 principles of good governance for conservation: legitimacy, being directed, performing, being accountable and fair. But more and more, I think we need this thing called governance vitality, which was coined by Boreani and Hill in 2015, which is really about wise and adaptive governance. And I fear at the moment, in South Africa, we are not really enabling wise and adaptive governance. In fact, we're often going the other way. And a shock to the system, like a financial crisis that was brought about by COVID, actually have almost sent us in the opposite direction. So going back to Virgil, who kind of had the initial quote, maybe one day, he also said this, maybe one day we'll be glad to remember even these hardships. Thank you very much.